Hey, Tim.
Hi,
How's it going?
not so bad. Just finished your part 10 or whatever it was, 271 to go.
271. Yeah. Yep. Um, yeah, it's kind of funny. Yeah, 10 days in.
Yeah,
It'll be interesting to see what happens next week when school starts, because I think that's
yeah. Well, partly because you're talking about it so much, and partly because um, I don't have any real connection. There is you. Um, I've sort of, okay, what happens? What else? What's the other equivalent, etc., etc., etc.? And as I say, I've been pushed rather than jumped about equal numbers in the sense of I've had typically six professional employers. And
mhm.
I've walked three times and been pushed twice.
Yeah.
Um, and the first time I got pushed, I just come to the end of a period of um, being off sick.
Mm.
And so there needed to be a closure to the medical forms. And they literally came and said, "Oh, we've got these forms for you to sign so you can come back properly, fully on next week."
Mm.
Signed them. Somebody went outside to copy them to bring them back. And in the absence of the witness, they, oh, by the way, we're taking your job as well. Can we have the car keys?
Wow.
Because it was a company car at the same time. I was 50 miles from home. Given their due, they didn't expect me to catch the train or anything. So
Mm.
they did drop me off. So there's a certain amount of sympathy. But you seem to be, I mean, partly because you've got this, from Wycombe position, you've got this oddball position of, there's another 271 days to go. Yeah. So,
Yeah, I
what,
think I would be feeling much differently if they had given me 2 weeks notice.
yeah,
So there
yeah,
is
2 weeks
that.
or a month. Yeah. UK wise, if you're a monthly salaried person, you're normally a month notice minimum.
Right. Right. If
Um,
I mean, I have been laid off in situations where when I was laid off from Silicon Graphics, along with like 2,000 other people, I was basically sent back to my office to clean it out and leave immediately. Um, when I was a couple of times when I was fired, I was basically walked out of the place. Not there wasn't security at either of these places, but one time I was fired in kind of a palace coup where a guy I was working. It was a little computer company, and I was the kind of sales and marketing manager. I was working directly for the founder, the president, and this other guy, he had brought this other guy in to be sort of a chief operating officer, and in consolidating his power, the guy decided I had to go. So one one day when the president Greg was not around, he was out on a trip, they got rid of me. um, the second time I got fired, I was fired for being a pain in the ass, specifically, and they were downsizing a little bit, and they said, they basically said, you're too much of a thorn in our side. And I said, oh, what about him? And they said, yeah, but he outproduces you. So So that was
Yeah. I
they
mean,
kept the other pain in the ass around. And the other pain in the ass was just sort of a pain in the ass. He wasn't, he didn't have a sort of
method to his
a well
madness.
thought out, sort of critique of the organization.
Well, in the in the case of signing the medical form one, they we generally didn't know at the time, as in sort of like the management down, the team management down, that they were actually paring back the company
Mhm.
to change the book status so that they were sellable to to be bought out. So
Right.
there was some elements of it as being personal, and some elements of it wasn't. So
Mhm.
I was fine. And oddly enough, it was just before lunch on Wednesday. So I got home just after lunch on Wednesday, made a couple of phone calls, and somebody said, "Oh, come in tomorrow." So I said, "Nah, I'll come in Monday. I won't." All right, give yourself a couple of days off at least.
Mhm.
And it sort of raised an eyebrow in the sense you just had like 3 months off sick.
Yeah.
And walked into the new office on Monday and got given the contract that I had just let for them to do the job that they were going to be doing for me. And that was the really stupid. Anyway, partly because you said about your Silicon Graphics, the pairing of the word Silicon Graphics sort of therefore has been, I haven't seen that word pairing for ages, has just been popping all over the place now, including when you were there. Were you there when the same guy that did Netscape and Mozilla type browsers was there? Elish.
I was there actually when I was there. Bob Bishop was the CEO. Who is so yeah so he the guy that you're talking about had been ousted, and but I was there in like 1999.
Ah, right, okay.
So it was they had bought Cray, and so actually I was located in Eagan, Minnesota, at the Cray kind of the Cray um, close to the Twin Cities home, because they had been
Yeah.
established in the Twin Cities, and then they had moved to Wisconsin, to where Seymour lived. But yeah, so I was in this beautiful campus in Eagan. They were really living the high life. But yeah, it was Bob Bishop was he preferred to live in Switzerland, and he was a very eccentric engineer. He was an engineer, but it was weird. It was just very weird. And over the years, the couple of years that I was there, they tried to migrate from their own, from a MIPS IRIX, MIPS processors that they designed themselves, and IRIX, their proprietary version of Unix, to an Intel Linux kind of a platform. And that did them in, because they were used to these 5-year product life cycles on workstations like the O2 and the Octane, and big computers like the Onyx and the Origin. And and in the Intel world, which I had been aware of because I had been in these companies where we built PCs, 6 months if you're lucky, before you have to redesign your system and your hardware architecture to kind of keep up with developments. And they had no.
Well, it's a minimum viable product, isn't it?
No. And so so basically they thought that they were going to get by. I mean, one of the things I remember one Bob Bishop did an all hands meeting, and we watched the video in the big, dining room on the Eagan campus. And he said and what they were banking on was really the military industrial complex, right? Because he was saying, okay, we have these contracts with the NSA, and and with the with the people who are running satellites, right? And and we've done the math, and this is what, if you're mapping the whole Earth, every orbit, right, and you're streaming that data down to servers, then we know how much storage you will need. And so based on those storage needs, the government at the time was saying that they were able to achieve resolutions of one square centimeter, right? Which is really intense. I mean, that's pretty good. But he said based on the number of hard drives, and arrays that they're buying from us, we believe that they're really scanning the planet to 1 millimeter resolution. And and so that was the type of thing that they sort of involved themselves in. But then they got involved in the kind of in the PC world of Linux clusters, and that was really that was their undoing. They did have some things. They did have unified memory architecture, which has become more prevalent. I mean, Apple uses that now in all of its machines too, right? Where you don't have dedicated CPU memory and then dedicated graphics and things like that. It's all kind of one path. So a lot of the technology that they developed found its way kind of into the more mainstream world.
Because what popped up, given that guy, if it was before Bishop, was when he left Netscape and Mozilla, he went off and formed Brave as a browser, and kept his right wing and anti-gay and anti this, that, and the other thoughts a little bit more to himself, but not totally.
Right.
It's been, somebody's figured out that if you look at somebody's website with a Brave browser and they are offering you an affiliate link, Brave swipes the cash from the affiliate link. So
that's interesting.
So that's it. They take so for instance, I started to learn about affiliate links a lot when I was literally watching that Canadian guy Steve Dotto. He's talking about doing second flush businesses, online businesses, and how affiliate links work. And he was quite open about it, and he even showed his account on some of his webinars to say, if you use my link to go look at Amazon, everything you buy at Amazon that day comes to me. Albeit it's cents on the dollar.
Right.
But it means that even if you don't buy the IT stuff, and you go away and buy, two tons of toilet rolls or something, right, I get a cut for the toilet rolls. Right? Although there are some products they don't cut them, but in the round. And so I thought, so the other thing that happened was the browser was sitting between other people that have paid for adverts. Or if you go to the New York Times, say, page, you get the New York Times adverts biased by where you are. And Brave was sitting in between that and changing the adverts. So there's a whole hoo-ha going on about Brave.
That's interesting. Yeah, I used Brave occasionally, but I hadn't.
Link is in the chat.
Oh, okay, good, thanks. I see it, and I'm sorry that the recording didn't. It says it's recording now. I've got this new update to Zoom. It's got all this crazy stuff on the sidebar. I think it says it's recording, so I assume that I'm going to get. Last time it wasn't. It asked me to update, and then it actually said it couldn't update. So would I open it in a browser? And so I said yes to that. And I think that was my mistake.
Yes,
I let it open in a
I
browser.
remember you saying that. I remember you saying. Anyway, I managed to capture almost just in case that I could cut and paste it straight away.
Okay.
The chat, so I put the chat up in the Obsidian
Thank you.
vaults.
Thank you.
Now,
And,
whether
and I almost got into the Obsidian Vault and made some notes today because I really did like this this long narrative that they have in chapter 6 about Rose Wilder Lane, which I was really not that aware of her role in in the production of her mother's books. And they, and it's kind of funny because I thought, Heather Cox Richardson used to just go on and on and on about about Little House on the Prairie and what a thing it was, and how influential it was and stuff. And so I went back to try to to see if she had written anything about that, because she used to talk about it all the time. But this, she talks about Luna Kelly and Laura Ingalls Wilder, and and doesn't really, just seems to apparently view them. I looked at the two references in this, and she talks about them in the context of Luna Kelly, who who unlike Wilder apparently was a populist, right? And so there's this whole kind of weird thing, and I was wondering about that as I was reading and listening. Was that okay? So where what is the how, because populism seems, or what I would tend to think of as populism, seems to kind of play a role in Lane's idea that the farmer is the source of all economic is the quintessential kind of economic individual, homo economicus or whatever, and that and that it's important to ignore all these infrastructural things like transportation systems and and government land grants and all that stuff that that enables people to and the army dispossessing the Indians of their land, to make this empty wilderness possible. Yeah, I was impressed with this chapter. She mentions, she kind of calls attention to Frederick Jackson Turner, which as a historian I love. I think my next historiographical post that I've got queued up is going to be Turner. Because that is, it's so so influential. I just hesitated. I almost said determinative of kind of the way that historians for almost an entire century kind of looked at, or at least for half a century, looked at the West. This idea that going to the frontier actually scraped the veneer of sort of decadent, corrupt civilization that Europeans would bring with them, and remade people in this American image, right, which was about individualism and self-reliance and all those things that they're saying, that Conway and Oreskes are saying, are these sort of Anglo-Saxon virtues that that Fee and Nam and whoever are sort of ignoring the racial and kind of racist and culturist elements of that, and just saying these are the Enlightenment values. So it's interesting that whole recapitulation theory sort of comes up with those Anglo-Saxon values just spontaneously. The frontier makes people into good Anglo-Saxons and Protestants.
Yeah. There's one that is a bit more other than I got the Little House on the Prairie TV stuff,
Hmm.
just as I was stopping watching that sort of tripod TV,
Yeah.
um, with which had I can't remember what the actor's name is, but it was little Joey Bonanza as the
Yeah.
father.
Landon, Michael Landon.
Yeah, whatever his name is.
And and then afterwards he went on I mean, and it's sort of when you think about it, Michael Landon's career, Bonanza, Little House on the Prairie, Touched by an Angel. So it goes right to that kind of evangelical, Midwestern Protestant thing.
Yeah, but the one that sort of I was partly more aware of from the politics side, because when I was watching Little House on the Prairie, I didn't realise it was a corrupted story, as it were. Like we now know, etc., etc., etc. And it has even been pointed out to me by a couple of Americans that are here. Anyway, was the Hayek book more than just the Reader's Digest version?
Mm-hmm.
And
then the cartoon, yeah.
And then the bees, what's his name? Bees position, but the person that doesn't seem to be mentioned yet, I might have missed it, but it doesn't seem to have been mentioned yet, is Rombert, who's another one of these Austrian economists.
Murray Rothbard?
Rothbard, yes, Rothbard.
Rothbard was actually, he wasn't really an economist, he was a psychologist. And he and his wife were sort of intimately, and I mean intimately, involved with Ayn Rand, and then they had a falling out, and then the objectivists kind of split.
Yeah, so it was more on the philosophical side,
and on the sexual drama side, apparently.
Yeah, no doubt. Ayn Rand had that predilection, didn't she?
She did.
And I've still only read Fountainhead because I thought the movie was quite good. Coming from an architectural building engineering point of view, we don't get movies about us very often.
Right. Right. Well, and in a way, Howard Rourke was almost kind of a surrogate for Frank Lloyd Wright in some people's minds.
Yeah.
He was an iconoclast, right? He had a vision that was unique, right? And was personal. I remember liking The Fountainhead a lot. I actually thought that the movie was. I thought that what's his name? Who was the guy who played it? It wasn't Spencer Tracy. It was the other guy.
No. It wasn't. It's too short for Spencer Tracy.
Yeah. I thought he was. He looked a little confused sometimes. Like when he was speaking in court, he didn't seem to have. I mean, he didn't seem to have the kind of the in your face thing that I imagined Howard Rourke to have. I also, and Howard Rourke, I imagined as a flaming redhead too. When I think the novel begins, right? Howard Rourke laughed, right? And then he dives into this pool. He's just been thrown out of architecture school. And he's okay because he's at the quarry diving in the water, which was actually not kind of an Eastern thing, but that's a very Midwestern image, there's all those, what was that movie that took place, the bike movie that took place in Bloomington, Indiana, with the stone, the children, the sons of the stonemasons, the cutters, breaking away. And they're diving into this deep pool that was formed by a quarry. Anyway, I'm off course here. Pull me back.
So only part way. It was Gary Cooper, of course.
Oh, Gary Cooper. Thank you. Yes. Yep.
Um, so in the same, so it was Mises' history that via Rothbard link and the Hayek book. It was Mises' history that I didn't know,
Hmm.
and it parallels Operation Paperclip so much,
Oh, yeah. There you go. Hmm.
right? So, and oddly enough, in the week that we've since the last uh, book club meeting, I've read Richard Harris's V2 novel, which is about how the Brits towards the end defeated the last few V2s
Mm.
being shot at London and Antwerp by putting a radar station right on the front. The problem was that all the technicians and the women from the Air Force that run that and did the calculations were therefore all within sort of artillery range.
Mm.
And, and therefore, of course, elements of Walter von Braun's negotiations with the Americans saying, if you take me and my team, we'll come with all the paperwork and we'll put a man on the moon. Because that was, at least within the novel, even before the war, that's where the early team with
Mm.
Walter von Braun came from. And it was always the saying of Walter von Braun, in the novel at least, was the first man on the moon has already been born.
Oh, really?
And
That's interesting.
he
Yeah.
was he was saying that in like 32, 30.
Wow.
Now I don't actually know when Neil Armstrong was actually born, but it can't be far off.
Yeah, it's probably close. Yeah, it's interesting, I mean, and when I hadn't thought about it from that perspective, about being aware of Werner von Braun, pre-war and stuff, but certainly that seems to be suggested by the Oppenheimer movie, right? That these people all knew each other and were
Oh,
aware of what the other, what the scientists who were on the other side had been working on, and so could make some type of
oh, well,
reasonable, prediction and guess about, how far along they were and,
it,
what
I mean,
directions their research might be taking.
it wasn't much more than 10 years since like the shutters came down. And I'm not sure when the last sort of free exchange at a science conference would have been, but it was probably after the Nazis came to power, but maybe not much after. So, and yeah, if you're communicating with all that level of
Hmm.
integration and you're not actually a company, which brings us back to the book
Hmm.
a bit more, and you're an open university doing base level research, then the only way to stay ahead and at the top of your game and stop being entrenched because you're 40 years old is to be on target, right? Up to date.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, it's, yeah, to have, well, and also to have that government funding. That was
Yes.
one thing that was impressed on me, was if I could get some outside money, that would potentially,
Yes.
although I don't know how that, I mean, I think that might be just grasping at straws too.
Yeah.
But
But also before we go off that slightly, as per I think you said in days 6 or 7, you're not quite sure where the union would stand on. If all of a sudden individuals jump the queue back into just because they came with money, it's like you now are paying for your own job. It's
right, right,
anyway,
which is not, I mean, which is a model that is, heavily used in the,
all the
R1s,
commercial.
for example, right? That's how you get a lab, right? In a
Yeah,
research, in a research university, is you find a funder, you find a project that is interesting enough to, to a funder, to pharma, or to, the
yeah.
industrial
So
complex.
I
You can get it.
so I was so I was quite pleased that my first brain actually made all the links between sort of things like Operation Paperclip, Mises and Rothbard and Hayek, and what we're talking about in this book. Because obviously they're talking about they want thinkers. And Mises was an interesting one because he was working for the proto-fascist government in Austria, such that he thought he would have a problem going to the US because, and now, of course, as I mentioned last week, Rachel Meadows has got her Ultra book coming, where I'm not quite sure what term she uses for, whether it's fascist or Nazi, attempted coup, or an attempt at a coup.
Right.
And I often wonder just how tight people think, or how different other people think fascism is from Nazism.
Well, and that's the thing is that this terminology, right?
Yes.
Yeah, I mean, fascism, Nazism, socialism, communism, right? And it seems like that was the big win for the people, for these people who become the neoconservatives is sort of confusing and conflating all of that and sort of creating this binary world where you could be a Stalin style communist, or you could be, whatever it was that they imagined as their open, free, democratic, and free market society. Although I think it's interesting by the end of chapter 6, they're quoting Lane as saying, as an American, of course, I am fundamentally opposed to democracy and to anyone advocating or defending democracy, which in theory and practice is the basis of socialism. So,
yeah. So, and it's all those terms that get used, and I still see it, particularly with seeing or listening to some of the more left side people from the US are very clear, saying socialism good, communism bad, but then also far right, ultra nationalist, ultra racist, master race Nazi types bad. And it's, what do you think the greatest generation ever, so say, did? They beat, Imperial Japan, the Third Reich, and Mussolini's Italy, and a few other, Hungary and Romania sort of got rolled into that by accident, and Finland got squeezed. So and yet, we even ended up with, what's the distinction between Oswald Mosley and, say, Mussolini? Because he's clearly a fascist, but he's only, in the same way as Mussolini eventually went under the wing of Germany because they were worried about, we've bitten off a bit too much that we can chew, invading Libya and Ethiopia and Sudan, right, and all the rest of it. So it was starting to join up in more than just US corporate politics. And the other one that sort of backed on itself was the Pew Trust. Because I've started to see what I regard as good works by the Pew Trust. They're actually funding some really good green stroke environmental work. and it's and I didn't know where they came from,
Right.
and as such, why would I? In that sense, and it's like,
Well, I mean, when you think about all of those people who are sponsors on PBS, right? The Arthur Vining Davis Foundation. I mean, holy crap,
yeah,
Arthur Vining Davis, Alcoa, right? That's the Mellon empire, right?
yeah.
And that, they're the people who, who basically, gouge the U.S. military industrial complex during the Second World War, right? And don't give them enough aluminum to make planes. Yeah, so it's weird. We have people do really create a legacy for themselves, or sanitize their legacy
And of
in
course,
in these things. The
just
Rhodes Scholarship, the
yeah,
Nobel
yeah,
Prize, the Pulitzer
yeah.
Prize.
I know. What did Pulitzer do? I only know it as a prize.
Oh, he was a yellow journalist. He helped us get into the Spanish American War. Remember the
Oh,
manual
right.
of that?
Okay. Oh, right. Okay. Yeah. So yeah, Nobel Prize is the obvious one. Um, although the cost of Booker Prize for a novel doesn't seem to have quite the same ring. But um, yeah, I mean, and of course, with this book reading the the slightly more fundamentalist Christian work of the Pew Trust, or Pew himself to some extent, and therefore not that far away as being another way of pushing, oh, we are a Christian country for you guys,
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
as though it's clear, stated, and simply outlined in the Constitution,
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
which it's not, etc., etc., etc.
Right.
So that also, the sheer amount of linkages and
Yeah. Yeah. No, I think there's
elements
an
of where
interesting. I
things
think
can be
there's an interesting
corrupted.
historical argument that hasn't been resolved yet about the, sort of the Christian nation argument, as well as along with this. I've been sort of queuing up books to talk about in my historiography section of my blog. A lot of the reading that I did, not research really, not primary research, but a lot of the background reading that I did for my fields had to do, because it was early America, it had to do with that question of what they call the market transition, right? This idea that at some point there was a transition to a capitalist market system from something pre-existing, right? And in European history, there's because of Marx to some extent, there's this assumption that it goes from feudalism to capitalism to communism, right? And there's a story about that trajectory. In America, because we didn't have feudalism, they had to really try to figure out, well, how did this work? We moved into an industrial system in the 18, from the late 1810s through the 20s, 30s, 40s, with textile mills and canals, and then ultimately railroads and things like that. But we didn't have sort of that feudal thing, and that's kind of also where Frederick Jackson Turner comes in and says, well, okay, we have this frontier experience where people go out to the frontier and they become, in Lane's idea, in Lane's mythology, right? They become yeoman farmers, they become Pa Wilder, and become self-sufficient and all of that. But that at some point they also get obviously enmeshed in markets. And so how does all that work? And there's been endless debate about, how that happened, when that happened, whether it really happened, or whether people were always involved in markets, which I think is more kind of my but it's also weird that all of this has to get, and one of the things that interests me the most, I think, is this process of of simplifying stuff so that it can be part of popular, or it can be part of the popular media, mythology, right? That it has to, like in this. I mean, one of the
It's the
things that
Reader's
impresses me
Digest
about
version.
these. Go ahead. I'm sorry. Go ahead, Tim.
It's the Reader's Digest version in that
Well, yeah,
sense.
it's the Reader's Digest version. It's the, it's all these references of simplifying Hayek's complex and nuanced analysis into this binary, that quote,
Adam Smith,
that quote from Lane from page, I don't know, 252 on my Kindle, that she doesn't like democracy, and she thinks it's inimical to America. But then he immediately, or they, Conway and Oreskes, immediately says Mises did not agree, and 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 that, well, even Mises, who, I mean, he was an aristocrat, right? And so
yeah.
that's the image that I always have of these people, these aristocrats. And it didn't help, that when I went to Fee, it was in this mansion on the Hudson River in Irvington, and right next to Tarrytown. So it was not that far up. It wasn't really the Catskills, but it was kind of Rip Van Winkle country, north of in
But
Westchester.
if you take the two big communist countries, they all went from a feudal position to a industrialized position without going through markets in that sense. I mean,
Well,
the
yeah.
Soviet Revolution sort of let's industrialize under the big managers.
But with 5-year plans, yeah, under Stalin.
Do it with 5-year plans instead, which never really worked for them. And that's always tagged by those who are not left. They may not be far right, but they're not left, as why socialism fails. They never take the mid ground for the likes of France, Germany, UK, Italy, etc., in spite of all the interference with elections from that.
Yes, and I think that goes to what Mark just put in a couple minutes ago. Put in the chat. So, what are the foci? What are the key elements of this simplification? Right, and I think it is that focus on collectivism, right? That we are going, and central planning, right? Both of those things, right? Collectivism, especially in like Maoism, but then central planning in the case of Stalinism, right? So, the thing, Tim, that you're pointing to that happens in social democracies, especially in Europe and especially in Northern Europe, in Scandinavia, is not central planning, and it's not the government owning the means of production or collectivizing farms or anything like that. It's taxing private business. And that's the thing they don't want to talk about.
Yeah. So, and then there's always this, as Pat's just put up, about who's pulling the strings. Goes back to the Wizard of Oz behind the curtain.
Yep.
Stroke Illuminati, stroke whoever else you want to.
Right. Well, and also that thing that I posted in my historiography thing right at the beginning, with the most influential book that I read as a history PhD student was Morton Horowitz's Transformation of American Law from 1790 to 1860, I think were the dates. And he was a Harvard law professor and legal historian. So he was like the last person that I expected was ever going to say this. But as I started, and I was told to read it, so I started reading it, and I thought, and then it just like blew the top off my head. Like, this guy was saying that the American legal system and American society that we have was done by this sneaky coup, really, of this legal and business owning class, either in cahoots or just having shared interests, and not, none of these changes in the law go through a legislative process where, representatives of the people debate on them, right? They're all legal precedents, and mostly lower court legal precedents, right? Mostly just property law, property rights, and kind of damages and remedies kind of things. And this is how all this, especially environmental regulation, changes.
Can you stick that? Can you stick that as a
Yeah, you bet.
reference in the chat? So,
yeah, will do.
And obviously, that has a certain amount of reflection from when Alexander de Pfeffel was Prime Minister. He got his bum spanked a couple of times for trying to take the law process outside of Parliament and into number 10 only. And eventually he got chucked out, and eventually he lost his seat. So there's a certain amount of democracy did win, just scraped through on its skin of its teeth.
Uh-huh.
And there's clearly no end of examples on both sides of the aisle, as it is in the US, or both sides. I don't know, have you ever seen the Houses of Parliament sitting? Because we've got the equivalent of C-SPAN now in the House, and all the you've got this basically a green carpet on the floor between the left and the right sides. And there's a red stripe a foot or so away from each set of benches. And the two red stripes are just over the distance between two swords. Because obviously, back when Parliament was first being Parliament, in the context of this, you're talking about just before certain kings lose their heads, etc., and backwards and forward, when a man was not dressed for good company if he didn't have his sword on his side. So
yeah, you weren't a gentleman.
Absolutely, yeah. And it's like pretty much the same as I'm sure I've said before. It's only when we got to Liz Truss that we've actually had a Catholic Prime Minister. We've had Jewish and we've had women before Liz, and now and now we've got our own brown guy. But him and his wife are multi-millionaires. And it's like I can't remember the exact numbers, but somebody did a calculation and said, oh, the members of the House of Commons, it's 75% millionaires.
Yeah, and even in the Commons, sure.
Yeah, in the Commons. Yeah, forget about the Lords.
Right.
And it's like, when did that happen? You go back through, say, to Maggie's time, and at that point, Maggie wasn't a millionaire, and neither was her husband, I don't think. And I could probably think of those people that were big names at that point. The only person in the House of Commons that may have been would have been Michael Heseltine. And he's actually a good, inverted commas, Tory, in that context.
Well, the trajectory had always been, though, that if you were, I was just, for my other project, my plutocracy project, I was kind of researching the Rothschilds last couple days ago, and it was kind of interesting, that trajectory, right? So you had Lionel the first? I think Lionel might have been the first Jew to sit in the Commons, because Disraeli had actually, he was of Jewish heritage, but he was Church of England by that time. And and Lionel Rothschild, I think, was the first practicing Jew, I think, to sit in the Commons. But then his son Nathan was in the Lords, right? So that was
Yes.
you were rich enough in Commons that then you got a peerage, and then you
Yeah.
graduated to the higher house, right?
Yes. But the house that actually you do less work in, even. And the other one, of course, that's happened in the last couple of weeks for the House of Commons is that a number of MPs, mostly Tories, but not all, have all been told they have got to give up their second high-paying jobs.
Mm.
And one of the ones that is in part responsible for that reaction is, I forgot what her surname is now, but there's a woman called Nadine or something. It's a real Boris Johnson fan.
Mm.
She hasn't spoken in the House for something stupid like 400 days and hasn't actually been present in the House
Mm.
for over 300 days
Wow.
because she's now a TV presenter on the TV station that's going bust because nobody's watching it.
Don't quit your day job is the message there.
Yeah, the UK version of Fox News, GB News.
Mm.
So, and the other big name at GB News, of course, is Nigel Farage.
Mm-hmm.
So the informal connections seem to be well over the old school tie. Who knows who? It's very seems to be very much more. What use can you be to me?
Mm-hmm.
And I'll see if I can't get you a whatever, a seat, a period, position, whatever. And I also know a couple of lefty type journalists who have been pushed out of right wing or more right than left based on print media titles, and they were there deliberately to be out, in most cases, deliberately to be able to say, but there's him or her, we employ him or her to give us balance. A bit like saying, we've got our token black person or our token woman
our false equivalency going.
Yeah.
Yep.
And it's almost as though instead of working our way to those sorts of explanations of why things happen, because all the other sensible, reasonable ones have gone by the board, it's almost as though that's where everybody's starting and working back to the good things. The previous chief of procedure, you asked about our police last time. Special Branch had its own little fictional series on TV that showed them in really good light, a bit like the GI men type 1940s, 50s.
Well, MI5 had a show too, didn't they, recently?
Yeah, but
10 years ago.
That's relatively new. But back in the day, there was this, and that was the only real information most people had. But for instance, in the UK, in spite of the elements of homophobia, racism, misogynistic, and all the rest of it, the last head of the Met was a woman who happened to be an open lesbian.
Mm.
So what's her name? Dix. I've forgotten what her first name was. And you might have seen her on TV as she was often deliberately present at a lot of the XR rebellion protests where they blew themselves to the roads and stuff. I think maybe 3 or 4 meetings ago, I sent a link to a House of Commons committee meeting where there's an MP who used to be Labour, he's now Conservative. He walked across the aisle. Or we would normally say walk to the other bench. Where he was criticising the current Met Commissioner because the XR protest that was outside had delayed him getting to his office that day. And he wanted them arrested for no reason. So the Met Commissioner pushed back and said, well, when you change the law, then I'll be able to do that. But for as long as the law is as it is at the moment, I can't arrest them for just protesting. And I thought, hey, we've got a reasonable cop. That said, I've got a few activist friends on the Green side who have repeatedly written to the Metropolitan Police to ask them to investigate the Holocaust that's happening, caused by government politics and policy for not rolling back the oil companies, etc., etc. And they've refused to do so. So there's actually an official complaint that's also been unaccepted as a complaint, but it's going back, is now in court as to whether the complaints department could refuse to take the complaint. So it gets a bit long and drawn out. And a bit like some of your cases recently, we've yet to have our version of weathermen, which is somewhat of a shame when it's but Kim Stanley Robinson, that science fiction author fave of mine, wrote The Ministry for the Future, where
I just had Amazon, I had Kindle recommend that to me yet again because I am reading this book.
Yeah. Well, if you'll get it recommended if you read Merchants of Doubt as well. But it's actually quite a good novel. There's a bit of, he could have put more in, but it's difficult with a novel because you're there for the story, not so much for the complete encompassing set of facts.
Sure.
And the gist of it is that there is this magical 35 wet bulb condition across India. And a good number, I can't remember whether they quote a number even, but a good number of people die. And the couple of green groups out of India decide to do a bit more than just protest. And they get linked up with other people. And they decide, we'll put big business down. How do you do that? What's the first step? And the first step is to say that business flying is fundamentally, because it's business and because it's flying, a bad thing. So they drop a few airliners. And it's surprising how fast people stop flying. It's a bit like dropping a lift in a hotel. How fast can you make that hotel have lots of spare rooms?
Right.
Drop a lift. And it sort of goes on from there. But eventually, the powers to be, particularly the Swiss banking side and the world banks, decide to come off the dollar and off the petrodollar and go on to the carbon coin. And so governments, as they are roughly now, start putting into carbon coin, and it all starts to turn around. You don't know if there's a happy end. All you know is the process has turned the corner.
Mm, mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
So it's a
All right. I'll
very
look
good
at it.
one. Yeah, it's a nice read.
Okay.
You can very easily start to say, oh, is this person, that person is a caricature,
Mm-hmm,
etc., etc., etc. So,
mm-hmm,
for instance, the woman they get to lead this ministry that it comes out of one of the COP IPC type meetings. Um, I think it might even be the Paris Agreement as
mm,
a how do we action the Paris Agreement? Oh, we'll make this ministry that is a UN based ministry. So they base it in Geneva because that's where the UN is, apart from the US. And who do we put as the top person without offending too many people? Oh, so we pick the equivalent of Mary Robinson from the past president of Ireland,
mm.
because she's done that sort of thing before, bring everybody together.
Yeah.
So there's a character that's obviously based on her that has a good third of the stories. She's the primary character in it, and she even meets a few of the terrorists, and uh, a lot of the story is about her department, her ministry, dealing with everybody else and trying to get everybody on side. It's a good story. I don't think it's quite as good as his Miles trilogy, but it's a good story.
Mm.
But
Okay. Okay. Cool. Pat, do you want to say something about this thing? I clicked that link and I noticed that under the cover image, it says documentary and fantasy. So what about this? What about this American Illuminati?
Well, I was just seeing what I could find by searching for the question I posed about who are the people who are pulling all the strings.
Mhm,
We all know that they're billionaires who are funding primarily, it would seem, the Republican Party
mhm,
to promote their own self-interest. And this whole book is about, in essence, a bunch of business people
mhm,
in the electric industry and the manufacturing industry who somehow very sneakily promoted the idea of freedom and government is bad, uh, all for the purpose, it would seem, of giving themselves the maximum flexibility and freedom to do whatever they wanted to add to their own coffers.
mhm.
Um, I don't. I was just asking the question of everybody here whether you all know of some great source, and so I started searching him. Although I think that film is perhaps a fantasy. There's perhaps some reality to it too. I'm going to go look at it.
Yeah. Well, and similarly, I think I mean she's very very focused on the end point is Jeffrey Epstein, right? But the 2 volume thing that Whitney Webb published recently, which is called One Nation Under Blackmail, right? The connecting thread, it was she in the first volume is very much about the Gilded Age into the era of of J. Edgar Hoover and that type of sexual blackmail and stuff like that. So that's sort of the connecting thread. But she names a lot along the way. I mean, the value for me is that I'm sort of mining it for the names of of people who who were either businessmen or part of organized crime, and sometimes it's hard to tell, right? And or part of the the police and military industrial complex, or or how all these people, and then if there's a thread of kind of Zionists in here, because they're on, there are Zionists in all of these things, and it's really interesting because she brings up people like the Bronfman family, right, which is a hotel family in Canada that becomes a liquor smuggling family during Canadian Prohibition, which precedes American Prohibition and then ends before the beginning of American Prohibition. So and to me that is really interesting, because it sort of points to the ambiguity, and she doesn't really specifically do this herself, but the way that she kind of lays out this story, it sort of points to the ambiguity of law, right? If you're a guy like Samuel Bronfman, right, what does legality mean? If you were in this business, it was outlawed in Canada, but you continued it in America. And then it was legal again in Canada, but then it was outlawed in America, so you could switch your operation and profit on in different ways. And then they buy the Seagram company, right? And then and so then they're completely legit. And then what's his name? Meyer Lansky complains later, the other famous Jewish, gangster, right? Complains later that why is it that the Bronfman family is legit and the Lansky family is criminal? So it's just, to me, that all that is kind of weird. And earlier, Mark, you mentioned Citizens United. Yeah, it makes it very, very, very difficult. And I think it's probably in Merchants of Doubt that Conway and Oresky talk about that a little bit, where they say, well, it used to be possible to sort of trace, in Merchants of Doubt, they're talking really directly about climate change, propaganda, right? And it used to be very easy to trace where the money was coming from that was going into different different sort of climate denial websites and things like that, and books that were published without peer review and all. And so they documented that, and they said it used to be, before 2008 or 7 or 8 or 9 or whenever Citizens United kind of went into effect, it used to be easy to track these things, and now it's much more difficult. It was hundreds of millions of dollars, but they can still kind of indirectly track things like, and again, that this also goes back to what somebody was saying earlier about kind of the religious element too, right? The Templeton Foundation, right, which was, it's again, it's kind of, Templeton's kind of an oligarch, but kind of a religiously oriented oligarch, and his foundation purports to be about sort of religion and morality in American culture and society, right? We'll be totally legit within a year.
What intrigues me about some of the arguments in this book are, when I look at it, it's about the subtle, I would consider them very subtle mechanisms and the money that the ultra rich are willing to invest in them. Mm-hmm. So when you have a whole chapter about, Mary Ingalls and, offspring somehow promoting a particular view of government eventually, I guess it's like, wow. I mean, if I had a whole bunch of money, maybe I would start thinking that way. But from someone who cannot manipulate the world around me, I try to be more direct when I can. It's just a very interesting argument.
Yeah. Well, and I think there's a context as well, Mark, right? Like that, like, at the end of the 19th and the first half of the 20th century, right, we had a bunch of people who were, writing stories that were not about what we now think they're about, the Wizard of Oz, right? Yeah. So Frank Baum is writing, this kind of populist story that there are a lot of people who are sort of, you know, who I think kind of provide a context for this. You know, let's tell a story that creates an image of America that conforms to a particular ideal. And there were definitely people doing it from a populist side or from a left side. It's, you know, it also blows my mind how much of this stuff kind of now is under the radar and is not remembered about American history, right? That there was that there was, I think the Rand School was mentioned very briefly, just in passing, just the name was thrown out by somebody, and it was as a kind of a slam on somebody that this person is associated with the Rand School. The Rand School was this, you know, in like from 1917 to 19, you know, it was this school of social science. It kind of was a progenitor of the New School in New York City, but it was socialist. It was like really, you know, kind of out about its socialism. So during the first Red Scare, it was really targeted, you know, under Woodrow Wilson, but it was supported heavily by people all over the country. Like, you know, it's kind of funny. This guy, you know, I wrote my dissertation about the peppermint oil industry, right? But there's one character that I found in Michigan, Albert Todd. It was mind blowing that he was a charter supporter of the Rand School, gave thousands of dollars to them. At one point, made a deal with them that if they would do something or other, I don't remember exactly what it was, he would write off their $50,000 debt. You know, so really, you know, really interested in that. He was a monopolist as well. So all these things are not kind of mutually exclusive, right? You know, operating in a free market, and you know, and that's the thing I think that, you know, we were talking about earlier, sort of the requirement to simplify these things into binaries, right? You know, you can either have the government controlling everything, or the government controls nothing. The government can have no role and no influence. You know, I mean, and Todd also established the Public Ownership League which was a national organization, which nobody remembers that even existed, right? And they went around and they, you know, because he had traveled, he loved going to Europe and buying up art. And so, you know, and unlike J.P. Morgan, he donated his art. He let institutions and, you know, and college, you know, Kalamazoo College, and even the public school system in Kalamazoo had his paintings on their walls. And then he gave it to the public, you know, in his will, which didn't happen in the case of the Morgan collection until way later. But you know, but as he was traveling around, and there's a, you know, and they actually write an article about this. He goes to Switzerland, and the Swiss had right, or just in the years, I think, after the First World War, the Swiss had nationalized their rail system, and so they had this national rail system that had been like the American one, had been developed by private enterprise with heavy government subsidy, you know, because they had a lot of tunnels to build under mountains and stuff like that. And, you know, but they decide to nationalize it. And so he goes to Switzerland, and he gets one ticket, and he gets to ride around, you know, for a month on the rail system, kind of like a Brit Rail pass or a Eurail pass. And, you know, and then somebody writes an article about this when he comes back, and they use this to talk about, you know, natural monopolies. And, you know, and he does a thorough analysis of the natural gas provision of natural gas in Kalamazoo, Michigan, right? And you know, how, you know, the economics of it, how it's being done, how it could be done, you know, and so they do a lot, you know, and this is at a time when, electrical grids are being built, and everybody is, everybody has gas lights in their, in their homes and stuff, and so there's a moment when things could have gone another way.
So
is also very
giving. So coming from a nationalised, now denationalised rail system, we used to have what was known as the central electricity generating board. And we then had about 10 publicly owned companies that did all the distribution and did the billing and did the last mile of cable into your house. So just after World War II, because in part, I think, it was seen how well that the additional government oversight required during the war to make everything work to the beat showed how it works quite well under those extreme conditions. So part of this book has always been harping on about rural power versus urban power as being, that's why public ownership should happen to things like big infrastructure, things that we look as being a service come minimum right, like the right to electricity, as it were, which isn't really a right, it's not in the Constitution. But, now that we've got it, and some instances, I presume that those co-ops and or publicly owned companies have gone back to being now privately owned companies, because same as the UK rail system. Of course, in the UK, they function it by having the private companies are those that operate the trains. But there's a nationally owned company that owns the rail and the stations, and therefore is responsible for the maintenance. So when a train crashes, is it pilot error, in inverted commas, or was it the track or the signals? Because if it's the track or the signals, then it's the government-owned company. If it's the train, so operator error, etc., then it's the private company. And
that's an interesting dilemma. If it's a private train operating on a public,
yes, because they and a bit like that, periodically they bid the route. So not so much an individual route, but it's a whole sort of slice of cake. So all the trains from Euston, or most of the trains from Paddington going in the distance, are Great Western at the moment, or were when I last looked. So Great Western bids for that service as a packet, and they could, in theory, lose. And there is mechanisms such that if they suddenly become a train operator with no track to operate on, what do they do with all their capital trains? They get given a price by whoever bids succeeds, so that they just change the colour of the plane, just change the colour of the train and carry on. So in electrical terms, and to a certain extent, those things that goes to houses. We had the GPO, single post office, that did all the telephones, and it would take you upwards of 6 months to get a line when you applied for one. Then when it flipped, it would take you like 6 days. So everybody thought that was good, but now, of course, with the water companies, they're serving their shareholders and so polluting rivers because it costs money to treat. And they didn't put it in their budget, etc., 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 etc. So now, of course, our slightly defunded EPA equivalent can't check fast enough and doesn't have the money to take them to court,
Right.
even though they're the government.
Well, if
right?
they don't find it, it isn't there.
Yeah, and the expertise and the number of people just isn't there. So how much of the older electric system that went rural is now wanted to be in, is now wanted by private companies to be inside their system because they want all the customers, but they don't want to have to pay for that build out. To buy it now, it's worth nothing now in that sense because it's paid for itself.
Right.
So they're going to get it cheap, yeah? But then they get all the customers at a higher rate, the current rate of electricity versus the cents that would have been paid 1920s, 30s, 40s, 50s, etc., whatever it happened to be. That's the robbery.
Yeah, well, and that's the thing. If you build out the infrastructure and then you don't account for it, I mean that's what happened in the U.S. with Global Crossing and all of those. You know, when the .com bubble or when the fiber optic infrastructure bubble kind of burst, right? That all those and all those companies went bankrupt. The fiber wasn't pulled out of the of the ground. I want to respond to what I said about FDR and fascism, because Pat, you just put something in there. I think that is something that historians and social studies curricula in America really don't want to go anywhere near. Right, the idea that that we have this definition of kind of what European fascism is, right? And and a lot of the time we talk about how it's about scapegoating, especially minorities, and and having this sense of we're gonna unify the country, the nation around a flag, and in order to do that we have to have an external enemy and an internal enemy, and all those kind of cultural elements of it. But then there's also sort of the economic description of fascism, which is this kind of tight coordination, where the private sector still owns the businesses, but they're tightly coordinated and cartelized and and economically managed in very tight collaboration, if not top down authority kind of relationships with the government. And so that's the element of the war, all these different war boards, the prices are fixed, production levels are set, people are told, not that they wouldn't necessarily have volunteered anyway because there were market reasons to do it, but that you're not going to make passenger cars for the duration. You're going to make tanks and troop carriers or whatever, and farmers are going to grow what we tell them to grow, and they're going to turn it over to us, and and we're gonna use it in the ways that that the government determines. I think that there are a lot of aside from kind of the tone and the reason, the rationale, for why the FDR administration was doing the New Deal stuff before the war, before we entered the war, and then why it's doing the war related stuff. Aside from from the story that it tells about that, how is that different from the things that fascist nations are doing as well? I mean, I think it's partially, yeah, Pat. It's partially, what you say about George Washington, I think is an important element of that, right? Because because the U.S. government doesn't at least seem to hang on to that, right? The appropriations boards and the price setting and all of that stuff goes away once the national emergency is over, right? So from that perspective, you say, well, okay, they didn't have the same intention that Mussolini had, right? To kind of, to that that the centralized control was the goal, right? Maybe that's a different, maybe that's really kind of the thing that we should be focused on is ends and means.
Well, if you moved it over to Nazi Germany, the penalty for not meeting your target is a bullet in the head rather than being fired and being replaced. So I'm not quite sure how extreme it got for Italy, but it got seriously extreme in Germany. Plus, as and when a business became really profitable, you'd suddenly get a group of businessmen in their black SS uniforms saying, "Oh, we take over from today."
Mm-hmm.
So the
right, but I guess my question, Tim, is that a difference? Is that a once it went, sort of over the edge of the cliff, or is there a difference in degree or in kind?
Well, I think with the Nazis, it was nobody ever got let off the hook. But then, of course, there was never any peace for them to say, "Oh, we can sit back." But it all seemed to be, it's going to be like this forever because we need the Nazism rather than the fascism per se needs to be the struggle,
mm-hmm.
and the struggle will never stop.
Mm-hmm.
So it would never be unhooked.
Right. And I do think that that's a difference. In America, there was not, it doesn't seem to me that the objective was on the part of FDR and his brain trust was necessarily to consolidate power in themselves forever, right? In the same way that it was in the case of the fascists in Spain or Italy or Germany or Japan, right? But on the other hand, there was also, to a certain extent, an idea, and this began actually in America all the way back in the progressive era, right? That there is an educated, elite, technocratic class that ought to be heeded and ought to be listened to and ought to be in a position to direct the economy especially, but also kind of society in general a little bit with things like health measures in the South, because they believed that all the poor people in the South had parasites and things like that, and they wanted to go out and do this public health thing and deworm them all. That kind of came from a lot of the times came from good intentions, but was also very top down. As I've been reading this, and maybe this is a little bit of a side issue, but as I've been reading this, I've been thinking a lot about Chrystia Freeland, who is a government minister in Canada still, I think, to this day. Before she was that, she was a journalist, and she wrote a book called Plutocrats, which I read years ago, and it still comes up in my Readwise feed every once in a while, notes that I made on it. And it was very unclear to me whether she was sort of celebrating the plutocrats or criticizing them, or kind of what her actual relationship was. I think ultimately her career trajectory suggests that she kind of wants to be one of them, right? She's one of those people that if you see sort of conspiracy stories about the World Economic Forum, then people like Macron and Justin Trudeau and Chrystia Freeland are always mentioned as the new crop of of people that Klaus Schwab is grooming to rule the world. So, so I don't know. I just think that the quest. I mean, I think that there is a kind of a means and an end, means and an ends thing. I think that I don't disagree with the definitions that you put up about fascism, Pat, but I think that from an economic perspective, I think there's kind of a blurry line for me between this tight coordination, and that would go to things like regulatory capture as well, where it's happening kind of in reverse, and and these things that happened during kind of especially the early phases before they go off they drive the car off the cliff and start rounding people up and putting them in concentration camps and stuff. So I'm out on a limb here.
So I think, in the current situation of 2024, the issue relative to Trump is whether or not his reelection, if it occurred, would be the beginning of a new fascist era in the United States. And that everything we've seen shows his tendency in that direction.
Yeah,
But
I guess that depends on the elements of fascism that are that you kind of focus on, because in what way is sort of the current government, or the current if not the actual government at the top, the deep state that's still running things, or the administrative state, censoring people on on Facebook and Twitter, and deplatforming people, and all that, and I mean that seems to have similar kind of elements of proto-fascism. So for one side to be saying that the other one is the obvious immediate path to kind of the jackboots and the SS uniforms, I think is problematic.
I don't know, when you call on an insurrection on January 6th, I think it's pretty obvious that that's an authoritarian takeover of the government in one of the most violent ways that occurs in history, is an armed attack on the government itself.
Mm-hmm. If it is as it's been portrayed, then I would agree with you.
Well, it's not portrayed. I mean, how is it portrayed? We all saw what happened. We've all seen all the investigation, all the documentation of it. I mean, to talk about portrayal, the effort of some Republicans to say, "Oh, well, it's just a tourist event," is
ridiculous. I agree. Yes, I agree. I agree that is ridiculous. But then is it all, if it's not just a tourist thing, again, there's a binary, right? Is it a tourist? I mean, the choice that we're given is it's either just a tourist event gone wrong, or Trump told them to hang Pence. I mean, those seem to be the choices that we're given, and I am not satisfied with that choice.
I don't know. If you look at January 6th, what happened on that day at the Capitol, and you look at what happened at the storming of the Bastille in French history, tell me what the difference is. The only difference is one was successful and the other one wasn't.
Well, in my delight into being seen to be fair, for the sake of being the
The non
the
the
opposite,
non-U.S. citizen. Okay, go ahead, Tim.
being the opposite side,
Yep.
without having to bring up the insurrection of 1776. One of the things I saw about not so much the tourist thing, but it wasn't to hang Mike Pence, was did anybody actually really look at the gallows that were being put up, etc., etc.? It was a piece of rope dangling from some 2x4s that wouldn't stand up to a person's weight and probably weren't tall enough, right? Except, of course, you just take the noose off the gallows, put it round its neck, hold on to one end and throw him over the balcony. That job done. Right? So I find I haven't yet seen why is it that there are, I don't know, what do we see? 60, maybe 100 of cops that are part of the unit that looks after the Congress building versus what, 10 to 12,000 people, of which you only need 1,000 to be really pushy, to push 100 cops out of the way, and about equal numbers of cops and protesters died. Ballpark, less than 10 of each, as I understand it, because I've not really been paying that much attention to that event. I mean, if you want to plan an insurrection, look at how we plan a coronation. Takes 6 months. What I find interesting is the responses that I see that are being made by various people about Trump's trial, and the recent reissue of the new indictment, where he's on tape as saying, go to the CCTV tapes and delete them, because it shows the people he's been speaking to moving boxes from one room to another, right? Or one room to a truck to move them somewhere else. And it's like, how would you explain having that number of boxes where you go and it's always, oh yeah, Biden's got a few, Obama's got a few. Yeah, so they may have 10 or 12 or 50 boxes even. But when the NRAR or the NARA, whatever it is, says, oh, by the way, we seem to be missing some copies, you've got the document, you've got them signed out, can we have them back? So they go find them and return them. He's been pushing back against, I don't have them. And even if I do have them, I'm not returning them. And even if I do have them and you come and take them, I'm not saying I had them. And it's like, the guy's nuts.
It is, well, and that's apparently, and again, I haven't been following it to the detail really to be able to speak, authoritatively about it. But my understanding of it is that he could have declassified those documents, and so, yeah, it's.
He even says that on tape. I'm showing you this. Oh, I shouldn't really show you this. This is secret. I could have declassified it. Now I'm not the president. I can't declassify it. I shouldn't show you. But this is a plan to invade Iran, and it was given to me by the Joint Chiefs of Staff.
Right.
And it's like, why would you, as a past president, say that you should have a copy of that? Access to it when you're writing your memoirs through the library under controlled circumstances for items that are still classified, assuming that the then president decides not to declassify it,
right, is
one thing, having controlled access. But it's like one of the acts that this.
Yeah. Well, I mean, but also this takes place in a context of, of people playing fast and loose with leaking classified or secret or semi-secret information all the time for political gain. And I think that's, I mean, I think that kind of goes to what Mark is saying in the chat too, that the politicalization of all of this and the weaponization of all of this has been has just gotten so much worse in the last decade. I mean, I mean, and again, it's these false binaries, right? The election was either completely unfair and stolen, or the only alternative to that is there was nothing at all wrong, and there's nothing to see here, and there's nothing that we can investigate or interrogate about about maybe the failures of the process on the day, or things that lead up to it, like the manipulation of information and the Hunter Biden laptop debacle and all of that. That all these things that and putting, I mean, this whole kind of I mean, this is a big myth as well, right? This idea that that this is the moment when America chooses, and 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 Americans have the the right information that they need, and they're making a valid choice, and and it needs to be handled, and we need to say at least that it was handled in this way, and that and that redistricting and and voter manipulate the manipulation, suppression, or promotion of particular voters in particular areas. All these, I mean, this is a very, very complex problem that we have simplified to the point where it is almost meaningless, and requires us to make these kind of blind or kind of dumb arguments in order to even be able to be involved in the conversation about it.
Well, going all the way back to and both sides are guilty of it, as I understand it. Even if you just start from gerrymandering, if you are playing about with voting boundaries to get the result that you think you want because past history shows, then that has to be taken away from sort of day-to-day politicians, given to some sort of AI, and left alone to redo that math from scratch. I mean, you all get, okay, we'll do like the very first election again, so that all those people that get elected on the midterms, tough luck, you've got to go for the gubernatorial,
right,
and do election 0 again.
Yeah,
because it's clearly corrupt, clearly.
Right. Well, and that's a huge question, is how do we back away from this brink that we've found ourselves?
Well, I understood that there were a couple of computer programs that do it by head count in a much more fair, shortest distance type approach.
Right.
And I've seen some of the district maps for the US, and they are torturous.
They're ridiculous. Yeah. Well, and Mark, it's absurd. Yeah, and Mark in the thing said voting patterns, right? So yeah, but also the way that we talk about voting patterns, right? I mean, because people regularly say, well, blacks tend to vote, 60% of blacks are going to automatically vote for the Democrat or whatever, and maybe that's changing, and maybe we're worried about that changing, but somebody else, I don't remember who it was, but I saw somebody on a podcast recently who said, yeah, that may be true of the blacks that vote, but only 45% of the blacks vote. So what's 60% of 45? That's the number of people who really, are really supporting, are this black Democratic base. And that, and so the ways that we talk about that are are very. I mean, they're constrained by, kind of because nobody has the time to dig down investigate all of the assumptions in every statistical, or numerical data point that somebody will come up with, and there's so little trust right now that the numbers and the data and the and all of that as reported is valid and and can be depended on. That I think that just leaves us in a bad place where everybody at this point. I mean, the cliche from Daniel Patrick Moynihan, the cliche line was, right, you're entitled to your opinion, but you're not entitled to your facts, right? But what are the facts? Whose facts? Who created the facts? And and what assumptions was that based on? I mean, at the time when Moynihan probably said that, which is probably late 60s, early 70s, it was a consensus era. There was a belief, and they've had there's been this ongoing sort of debate about, Walter Cronkite as the most trusted man in America. I saw a debate recently about. It was one of those monk debates about, and it was Matt Taibbi and some British journalist against, I think, Judith Miller and Malcolm Gladwell, and it began with 52% of the audience saying they didn't agree with the proposed the proposition that we shouldn't trust the mainstream media. And by the end of the debate, Taibbi had done Taibbi and his partner had done a good enough job, and and Miller and Gladwell was insane. He just went totally ad hominem and was like a lunatic. So he really destroyed his side and showed what a pompous ass he really is. But it went the other way. I mean, 60 plus, I think high 60s percentage at the end of the thing actually agreed that we can't trust the media. And that's, and at the time, and Gladwell actually was insulting. He was trying to insult Taibbi that, oh, you just yearn for the 50s when white men were believed and and were central and and were the authorities, and people like Walter Cronkite were trusted. And and Taibbi's point that he was trying to make was actually that one of the reasons that 2 years in a row Cronkite was voted the most trusted man in America was that network news, because of the business model, was trying to reach a wider audience, right? And was trying to not polarize, right, and not go just one way or the other in a kind of very partisan way, the way we do now. But and I don't think he was ignoring the fact that that this consensus world that we lived in was a very very constrained worldview. But that's all part of this this problem that we have right now as well.
So is it better that we all trust Tucker Carlson?
Do we trust Tucker Carlson, or do we just kind of do we just? I mean, I don't trust him. I think that he is.
Or do we rewrite? Or do we only trust him when he rewrites his job description as being not comedian but actually news anchor?
I think that he is useful at times in calling out absurdities, in the same way I wouldn't say that I trust Tucker Carlson in the same way that I wouldn't say that I trusted Jon Stewart, when he was doing the Daily Show. But Jon Stewart was calling attention to when the emperor had no clothes on and nobody else was willing to say it, in a way that Tucker Carlson similarly is right now, for their own, both of them for their own kind of partisan reasons.
Yeah. So partly because the insularity of Americans, you might not have noticed, but News Corp has lost 75% of its value in Australia recently.
Mm.
So, and that seemed, and the trigger for that, or the tipping point for that, seemed to have been the revelations of the debate that went on that came out in court over Tucker Carlson.
Mm. Yeah.
So Tucker's firing, rather than Tucker, has actually seemingly done some good, and it's then now going to be a case of how far do those ripples and how fast do those ripples go round, such that you can see that these chapters in this particular book, those people that are deemed to be bad, if they were told you could only own not even necessarily one newspaper, but let's say just two, and not overlapping circulations even, that would be seen as a infringement on their personal rights, as opposed to, where's my personal rights of getting a diversity of opinion?
Mm-hmm. Right. Well, and they did. I think there have been some, like at the end of that debate that I watched the other day, there were some moments when it was all, people almost got to that question of, okay, so how do we repair this? How do we step back from this precipice, right? And I think that is a kind of a legitimate question, and journalism used to be about, sort of citing sources and, kind of transparently, not, a government source that, that told me this on the, if I promise not to name them, which means that, anybody can leak anything at any time, without any type of consequences, right? Accountability for, for things, when they turn out to be true or false. I don't know. I mean, Mark, you say.
But in journalism terms, you've got to get back to the point of President's Men, really, haven't you? Mm-hmm. You've got to get back to the point where I may not cite sources in the article, but the editor, the corporate that's supporting them, has value into the opinion that we are publishing it because it's true. We can prove it if we're forced to, but for the sake of deep throat, stroke the whistleblower, we can't tell you who the whistleblower is. And even that still exists. I mean, now virtually every time I go look at The Guardian online, one of the non-article pieces that pops up is, this is the channel to talk to us without it being tracked.
Mm-hmm. Right. Yeah.
So well, making it easy, but
I think that there is. I mean, there is that. Mark, you had said something in the chat about the kind of the question of values, and I don't think that. I think that probably that idea, that Walter Cronkite era idea of impartiality was mythical itself, right? Was kind of manufactured consent, and and so I don't think that anybody wants to go back to that. I think people are nostalgic about that because if they don't really think about it too much, they can think there was a time when people agreed, when American culture was this thing. There were the wonder years and all of that. And of course, all the people who were not included in those, those wonder years are, can immediately call attention to, to the discrepancies there. But also, that idea that, that there were stories, there was a national story that there was a consensus on, just all the things that are left out of that story are problematic. So I don't think that we can go to a place where where we can reasonably expect people to be impartial or to not have, to not be speaking from a position. I mean, the whole point, as we've talked about, when we've talked about, note making and stuff like that, the whole motivation of why you're doing it is central, right? To actually doing the work. And so I don't think that ever goes away, but I think there needs to be something, somewhere where people can show their work and say, okay, these are these are the data points, these are the sources I cite. I don't, like I said, I've been fascinated by this, this work that Whitney Webb has done, but I don't know anything about her. As she might be a total crackpot, she might be a scholar. I don't really know. I'm trying to judge what she's doing on the basis of the sources she cites, right, and the breadcrumb trail that I can follow to sort of validate, whether or not this is credible information, whether it's useful to me, even if I have a different use for it, right?
What's her name again?
Whitney Webb.
Whitney, as in Whitney Houston.
Yeah, and WEBB. Yep. So I think, and again, I have no, I'm not recommending or endorsing anything, because I don't, because all I'm doing at this point is sort of mining her, her data. She, I mean, it's like a Zettelkasten, right? She has there are a whole bunch of data points. She, creates a path between them, which I may or may not end up agreeing is the path, that I want to walk, in this forest between these, these names and dates and events and stuff. But, sort of calling attention to the fact that they're there is valuable. Oh, what's this, Pat?
I've just started reading this book on how Generation Z is going to save America.
Oh, good. I hope they manage it.
It has interesting points in it.
Cool. All right.
The best educated generation in our history. So forth.
Interesting. All right. Well, it's 11:56. Have we resolved this? Next week we're going to do I think I didn't manage to save the notes, but I think next week we had talked about doing 7, 8, and 9, or was there more? Was there going to be more next week?
No, that was it. 7, 8, and 9.
Okay. All right.
As I said, that was one of the comments in the chat that I did manage to catch.
Oh, good. Okay,
so
good. Thank you.
So it's 7, 8, and 9, then 10, 11, 12, and then 13 to conclusion.
Okay, that'll work.
What I did notice though was that there is a book section stroke part change between 5 and 6, and 9, 8, and 9. So there's 4, 5, and 6 actually covers 2 large areas outside of 3 chapters. So that threw me a bit when I started reading it, because I hadn't actually noticed that before. Oh,
you're in part 2. Yeah, 5 and 6 are in part 2. Yeah, which I don't know. I mean, foundations, marketing, mainstream, and beyond, I'm not sure that I don't really understand.
They're not radically. It wasn't radically far enough. It was just that I went over this part change, and I thought, oh, did I read it right? I had to go back and check.
Right. Okay. Well, yeah. Then that's what we'll do next week, and that will be after my first week of school. So we'll see what kind of week I have. Yeah, and I will try. And Mark, I appreciate your reaction in the Substack. I'm trying to be less,
All that.
you
Yeah,
know.
that was actually my wife's reaction.
All right.
But you know, that's our morning ritual now. We wait for you to put up your latest thing, and then she turns down the television because we're usually sitting there watching television, so she can hear too. So
Oh wow,
we've become hooked. Maybe that's your intention. No,
that's good. That's good. I like that. Yeah,
that's the point, right?
it's like Peyton Place. Yeah.
You know, is there a book about these kinds of things? I mean, I've been a blogger for 20 some years, but the notion of, I don't know what you even call these environments. They're a way to bring together, instead of bloggers all being isolated, and especially my impression with the downward trend of RSS and stuff.
Mhm.
You know, if you're not part of one of these collectives, I guess that's a term.
Yeah.
You know, even being read is a challenge. And then, of course, on top of that, you have the financial opportunity, which may or may not be real.
Yeah.
I don't know. I'm just interested in that. And that, since one of the themes of this group over time has kind of been, I would say, the development of content for the purpose of having a voice or writing or whatever you want to call it. And
Mhm.
these kinds of outlets seem to be one trend anyway.
Yeah.
I don't know if there's, you know, so we've read about note taking, and it's always about what's the purpose.
Mhm.
This is a purpose, right?
Yeah.
And I
Right.
don't know if there's any good review, any good analysis of this, just this kind of citizen, you talking about citizen historians,
Mhm.
you know, citizen, whatever we are,
Yeah.
kind of as writers. I don't, that would be interesting. And somebody ought to write it if there isn't. And I would certainly read it.
Yeah. Well, maybe we can talk about that at the beginning of our next meeting, because I do think, yeah, Medium. I mean, for a while I was kind of doing Medium. I had a WordPress. I did my own things. The whole, the whole Substack and YouTube combination is interesting. You know, your question, Pat, about how, about where my searches are going, and how people might be able to help is. Yeah, is weird, so yeah, I'll be thinking, I mean, I suppose, especially this week, kind of going back to school, I'll be thinking about, sort of higher ed. I mean,
That's
higher
a
ed
whole,
and
your
and and
situation.
and kind of general, communication, and then
Well, that's
also,
right. What do you tell students now?
yeah, yeah, and then public, I mean, and then it's all, I mean, but I've been, for a decade or more, I've been thinking about sort of publishing, mainstream
Mm-hmm.
kind of publishing at presses versus, whatever this is or whatever this is becoming. And I do think that I am going to need, especially if I'm going to have any type of an opportunity to do something that doesn't involve, getting another job at another institution. I need to crack this code. So yeah, I'll be working on that. Yeah, so maybe we'll talk about that a little bit beginning of next Saturday.
But the other thing that I think that is particularly with Medium and definitely with Substack is they have all the people that produce on there seem to be starting to comment on each other a bit more, to drive a bit of commentary.
Mhm. Yeah, when you can do that without being a paying subscriber.
Yes.
Yeah.
And I can't think of one that I can't do that on in Substack. What I do see in Medium is that I get like the top 2 paragraphs and it all grays away like the New York Times does.
Mhm.
But for the New York Times, there's a couple of little hacks that allows you to look under the grey.
Oh,
Yeah, so New
I
York
don't, I
Times.
don't, I don't know those hacks. I just get annoyed and say, "Ah, damn it, New York Times, I'm not going to read it. They don't deserve to be read if they're going to paywall this."
Because my initial reaction would be, kind of the medium model would be more appealing, partly because, we've talked about Brave. I've been spending money. I've spent money on Brave. I kind of believe in the I don't know what you call that, the where you kind of allocate small amounts,
Mhm.
you know, across those that they have to subscribe, or
Mhm.
I mean they have to sign up with Brave, but
Yeah.
that it's allocated based on your viewing history
Mhm.
across sources.
Yeah. Yeah, I think that's. I
Micro
mean,
something.
I think that is a potential solution. And that was, and Jaron Lanier called for that. Sort of that micropayment kind of model,
Right, micropayment.
for creators. Yeah, that. Yeah, I think it's. I mean,
which is where you end up
we're
with,
moving towards some type of new market, hopefully.
Right.
which
Yeah.
is where micropayments, as in you can do very low number on Patreon, and
Oh,
the downside of Patreon is because Patreon do a service, not all the money that you spend goes to the creator. Whereas if you go to
sure.
GitHub, for instance, partly because GitHub is much more of a co-op,
Right.
all of the money you pay into GitHub goes to the creator
Mhm.
or the creator team if it's a team effort.
Mhm.
What the team do with it after that is anybody's business. But the transparency of those payments, and if you end up with, say, oh, I've got 10 people I pay at GitHub, and a bit like I do with Google Alerts for keeping an eye on certain people being reported in the news or in the magazines or in the journals.
Mhm.
And that becomes untenable very quickly.
Yeah.
Until you say, no, I only want to be told this once a week.
Mhm.
And you either make a group of them one day a week, or you make them all one day of the week and just go back and feed it. And it's like, I'll pay the equivalent of 50 cents to 50 people once a week.
Yeah.
And,
Well, and can you do that? And at what level does the carrying cost or the
Right.
intermediary, charge become too
well,
much?
GitHub is zero.
Yeah. Right. Yeah.
GitHub
Yeah.
is
If
zero.
only the readers were all at GitHub, it would be easy.
Yeah, but the important thing is that where you ask for, can you pay, if you can pay something for my Substack, is fine. But then, like, if you go, when we were back all being Obsidian freaks back in the early days, one of the people we spoke about was Brian Jenks, the tall guy,
Yeah.
who's now so erratic on his YouTube. What he does is quite good most of the time, but it's so erratic. It's not always
Well,
that.
he's great, but he spends half his time talking about Obsidian and stuff, and the other half talking about ADHD, which kind of makes sense.
Yeah.
That's why it's erratic.
Yeah, for him. Yeah, but he says you can pay for via whichever ones he uses. So I don't think he uses Patreon, but I think he uses something else. And GitHub. I mean, he also says, and not forgetting that GitHub don't take any fee for doing it.
Commission, yeah.
So if you're in software pretty pattern stroke that end of the market,
Yeah.
as opposed to writing a blog,
Right.
then almost everybody will be in GitHub anyway. I mean,
Yeah.
I'm not software, but I'm in GitHub, but I
Right.
don't use it. I just use it to pay.
Yeah. Well, and maybe if I do something that is more oriented towards the sort of note making, and an Obsidian and my note making book and stuff like that. If I turn that into a course, maybe GitHub is a place where I will find a readership or a market for that.
And of course, you then put it into the Obsidian forum, etc., etc., etc.
Mhm, yeah.
Of which most of the respondents in there are also likely to be on GitHub.
Right. And probably Reddit is more adjacent to GitHub as well. Yeah. So yeah.
It's not
So
a Facebook.
it'll
It's certainly not a Facebook thing.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. Okay. Well, I will. We'll talk some more about this next week.
Ciao, ciao. Best of luck.
Take care.